Welcome to medieval Scotlanda, land where nature itself seemed determined to kill you. Imagine living in a place where winter lasts half the year, the wind cuts through your skin like a sword, and the only constant companion is rain. If you thought life was tough now, just wait until you hear what it was like back then. Pause for effect. This is not just history. This is survival horror with kilts. Let's start with geography, the first and most unrelenting enemy of medieval Scots. Scotland is a land of jagged mountains, endless hills, deep lochs, and more sheep than people. But in the Middle Ages, these natural features weren't just scenic, they were deadly. The highlands, those majestic mountains we all love to photograph today, were treacherous. Travelling across them could take days, even weeks. Roads didn't exist. Bridges were rare. And if you fell into one of those icy lochs, well, at least you died clean. And don't forget the terrain. Much of the land was rocky, wet, and nearly impossible to farm. Unlike the fertile fields of France or England, Scotland offered up rocks, bogs, and heather-covered hills that laughed at your attempts to grow food. Now, let's talk about the climate. In short, it sucked. Hard. Scotland may not have been tropical, but it wasn't always this cold either. During the Middle Ages, Europe went through something called the Little Ice Agia period of unusually cold temperatures from around 1300 to 1850. In Scotland, winters lasted 6 months. Snow covered the ground for most of the year in the highlands. Even in spring, frost could return overnight and ruin crops. Imagine planting seeds in April, only to wake up to an ice age the next morning. And the wind? Oh, the wind was relentless. It blew so hard it could knock you off your feet. One wrong step near a cliff, and you'd be joining your ancestors much sooner than expected. So, farming. That sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. Farming in medieval Scotland was like trying to grow tomatoes on the moon. The soil was poor, the growing season was short, and the weather was constantly trying to sabotage your harvest. Crops like wheat refused to grow. Barley and oats were the only grains that stood a chance, but even they struggled. If you managed to grow something, there was no guarantee it would survive the next frost, flood, or hailstorm. Livestock had it rough too. Cattle needed shelter from the cold, but building barns was expensive. So many animals simply froze to death during the winter, which meant less milk, less meat, and less trade value. Basically, famine waiting to happen. Famines were common in medieval Scotland, and when I say common, I mean every few years. If the harvest failed, people starved. There were no supermarkets, no food banks, no government aid. If your village ran out of food, you either left her, you died. People resorted to desperate measures. They ate bark, roots, weeds, and anything else they could find. Some even turned to cannibalism in extreme cases. No joke. History doesn't sugarcoat things. And guess what? The rich weren't immune. Nobles could stockpile food, but once their stores ran out, they were just as helpless as everyone else. So, what did we learn? That geography and climate were two of the biggest reasons life was brutal in medieval Scotland. Between the rugged terrain, freezing winters, and unpredictable harvests, Survival was never guaranteed. But hey, at least it wasn't raining. Wait, actually, yes it was. Always. Pause for humour. All right, we've survived geography class from hell. Now let's talk about daily life. Picture waking up at dawn, stepping onto cold stone floors and immediately getting to work. No coffee, no toast, just another day of chopping firewood, herding sheep and hoping your neighbour doesn't decide to stab you over a missing goat. Pause. Life wasn't easy if you were born poor in medieval Scotland. But hey, at least you weren't a cow. First things first, let's talk about where peasants lived. These folks didn't have mansions or castles. They had, well, basically anything that could keep out the wind and snow. The most common type of housing was the Cronogus small house built on stilts in a loch. Why build your home on water? Because it kept raiders out, or so they hoped. Of course, it also meant you had to cross icy waters every time you wanted to go outside. Pause for effect. Other peasants lived in simple wattle and daub huts. These were made of wooden frames filled with mud and straw, then plastered with clay. Sound cozy? Not really. These huts were drafty, damp, and often smelled like wet wool. And don't even get me started on the rats. Rats loved these huts because they were warm and full of food. Now, let's talk about work. If you were a peasant in medieval Scotland, you worked hard, like really hard, from sunrise to sunset every day. Men spent their days ploughing fields, herding sheep and chopping wood. Women were just as busy cooking, cleaning, spinning wool and raising kids. Oh, and did I mention they also had to make sure the cows didn't wander off? Pause. And let's not forget the kids. They didn't get to play video games or watch YouTube. Instead, they worked alongside their parents from a young age. By age 5, you were probably already herding sheep or fetching water. It was like childhood labour camp, but without the pool. Next up, let's talk about clothing and hygiene. Peasants didn't exactly wear Armani suits. Their clothes were made from scratch-usually wool or linen, which was itchy and uncomfortable. Wash day was a rare occasion, and when it happened, it involved boiling water over an open fire and scrubbing clothes by hand. Fun fact, soap was expensive, so most people used ash or urine to clean their clothes. Pause for laughter. As for personal hygiene, let's just say it wasn't great. Bathing was rare, and when it happened, it usually involved a freezing stream or river. Lice, fleas, and other pests were constant companions. So if you thought surviving winter was tough, try doing it while scratching yourself constantly. Despite all the hardships, peasants managed to create some semblance of normalcy. Families were close-knit, and everyone pitched in. Meals were simple but communal porridge, bread, and whatever vegetables grew in the garden. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions like weddings or funerals. Yes, funerals. Because death was always lurking around the corner. Pause. Women played crucial roles in the household. They managed everything from cooking to childcare to brewing ale. And yes, ale was important. It was safer than drinking water. Meanwhile, Men worked the land and defended the village from raiders. It was a tough life, but it was also one of community and resilience. Peasants didn't just work hard, they also paid taxes. To whom? To the nobles, of course. The feudal system meant peasants owed loyalty and labour to their lords. In return, the lords promised protection, which was nice if you didn't count the times they abandoned you during a famine or battle. Pause. Religion played a big role too. The church was everywhere, and priests held a lot of power. They blessed crops, buried the dead, and reminded everyone how much God hated them. Basically, they were the original doom scrolls. So, what did we learn? That daily life for peasants in medieval Scotland was brutal, but also full of resilience. They worked hard, faced endless challenges, and somehow managed to survive. Whether it was building huts, herding sheep, or enduring flea bites, they got through it together. Pause. Let's talk about food, or rather lack thereof. If you were lucky, your meal might include oatmeal, boiled cabbage, and stale barley bread. And yes, that was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Oh, and don't forget the rats, they loved to share your table. Pause for effect. Medieval Scottish cuisine. Bland, boring, and occasionally alive. So, what did people eat in medieval Scotland? Not much, honestly. Most peasants lived off a few basic staples: oatmeal, porridge, barley bread, and whatever vegetables they could grow, usually cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips. Meat? That was a luxury. Unless you were rich or had just killed something, meat was rare. Even then, it usually came from sheep or goat's snot. Exactly gourmet. And spices? Forget about it. Spices were like gold. They were expensive, hard to find, and mostly reserved for nobles who wanted to pretend their food tasted good. Now, let's talk about drinks. Water? No thanks, it was full of parasites and filth. So instead, everyone drank ale. Yes, even kids. Because compared to water, beer was basically a health drink. Ale was brewed at home, often weak and slightly sour, but it was safe to drink and gave you a nice buzz. It also helped make the food taste better, because let's be honest, nothing makes boiled cabbage sound appealing like a few pints of fermented grain. But wait, there was one creature that definitely had better meals than you, the rat. These little guys had access to everything you didn't. They stole your oats, nibbled your bread, and sometimes even got first dibs on the ale. Some historians believe rats were the real chefs of medieval Scotland. At least they got to taste test everything before you did. When harvests failed and they often did things got really bad, people resorted to desperate measures. They ate bark, roots, weeds, and anything else they could find. Some even turned to cannibalism in extreme cases. Famines weren't rare. They were regular events. Without supermarkets, food banks, or even a decent grocery cart, survival depended on luck timing, and whether your neighbour was willing to share. So, what did we learn today? That food in medieval Scotland was, well, not great. But Hayat, least you weren't starving alone. Everyone around you was eating the same thing. And if you were lucky, you had some ale to wash it down. Pause. If you made it through the weather and the famine, guess what? You still had to survive your neighbours. Because in medieval Scotland, everyone was out to kill someone. Pause. Clans fought constantly over land, cattle, honour and sometimes just because they didn't like each other's face. It was Game of Thrones but colder, smellier and without dragons. Scotland wasn't one big happy kingdom back then. It was a patchwork of clans. Each clan was basically its own mini-nation, led by a chief and loyal warriors who were ready to fight at a moment's notice. The biggest names, the Campbells, the MacDonalds, the Douglases, all families with long histories of loyalty, betrayal, and way too many sword fights. Feuds between clans weren't just disagreements, they were full-on wars. Sometimes over real stuff like stolen land or murdered relatives. Other times, over something stupid like which hill looked better in the morning light. The most famous feud? The Campbells versus the MacDonalds. Their rivalry lasted centuries and ended in one of the darkest chapters of Scottish history, the massacre of Glencoe. When diplomacy failed, it was time for war. Clans built castles to protect their lands, but enemies always found ways in, whether through brute force, betrayal, or sneaking in disguised as a bard. Sieges could last weeks or even months. Defenders would run out of food, disease would spread, and eventually someone would open the Getesa, sell out their friends for a warm meal. And if the clans weren't enough, there was always trouble from the south. England and Scotland spent centuries trying to kill each other. Border raids were common where Scottish reivers would sneak across and steal English cows, then ride off before anyone could stop them. It was like organised theft with swords. And honestly, the English kind of deserved it. So, what did we learn today? That life in medieval Scotland meant living with constant danger, whether it was your neighbour, your enemy clan, or the entire English army. You'd better keep your sword sharp and your back covered. Pause. Religion played a huge role in medieval Scotland, and it wasn't always pretty. The church had immense power, and people lived in fear of God's wrath. But along with religion came superstition and witch hunts. Pause for effect. Yes, witches were real. Well, sort of. Because if someone thought you were a witch, guess what? You were. In medieval Scotland, the church was everywhere. Priests blessed crops, buried the dead, and reminded everyone how much God hated them. Basically, they were the original doom-scrollers. The Catholic Church controlled most of society owning land, collecting taxes, and deciding who went to heaven or hell. And if you questioned anything, well, that's how you ended up accused of heresy. The church also had the power to excommunicate you, which in medieval terms basically meant you were spiritually dead and probably socially ostracized too. So, yeah, not great for your dating prospects. Alongside the official religion came a whole mess of folk beliefs and superstitions. People believed in fairies, ghosts, curses, and lucky charms. They threw salt over their shoulders, avoided walking under ladders, and lit candles to ward off evil spirits. And don't even think about stepping on a cracket might summon the devil. Some people believed that if you saw a hare near your house, it meant a witch was watching you. Others thought that if a cat sneezed while you were eating, it meant someone was plotting your death. Honestly, medieval Scotland was like a horror movie that never ended. But things got really dark when witch hunts started. Accusations flew like arrows in battle. If your cow died, your neighbour probably cursed it. If your child got sick, you blamed the weird old lady down the road. Thousands of women, some innocent, some just annoying, were dragged before judges, tortured into confession, and burned alive, all because someone said they danced with the devil. And guess what? Most of these accusations were made by other women. That's right, witch hunts were often fueled by gossip, jealousy, and petty neighbourhood drama. So, what did we learn today? That life in medieval Scotland meant living in constant fear, not just of war or famine, but of being accused of witchcraft. One bad harvest, one suspicious neighbour, and boom, you're toast. Literally. Pause. Women in medieval Scotland had it rough. They were expected to run households, raise kids, cook, clean, and sometimes fight off invaders while their husbands were away raiding other clans. Basically, they were the original multitaskers. Pause. And children? Let's just say they grew up fast. Education was rare, child labour was normal, and surviving childhood was a bonus, not a guarantee. For most women in medieval Scotland, life revolved around the home. They managed everything from cooking to childcare to brewing ale. And yes, ale was important, it was safer than drinking water. Marriage usually happened young, around 13 or 14. Not because they loved early, but because survival meant forming alliances through marriage. Romance? That was optional. Survival? Mandatory. If you were born into nobility, your life wasn't easier. You were often married off to secure land, power, or peace treaties. Your opinion on the matter? Not really needed. Now let's talk about kids. If you thought modern school was tough, imagine starting work before you could read. By age 5, most children were already helping out gathering wood, herding animals, or running errands. School? Only if you were rich or destined for the church. Most kids learned by doing. Literacy rates? Extremely low, but high, at least you didn't have homework. Childhood diseases, famine, and accidents were common. Infant mortality was high, so families had lots of kids hoping some would survive. It was like playing real-life Sims but without the save button. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about politics, economics, and family survival. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were married off to men twice their age. Consent wasn't exactly a thing back then. Once married, women ran the household, made clothes, cooked meals, and kept things running while men were off fighting, farming, or getting stabbed by neighbours. Pregnancy was constant and dangerous. With no modern medicine, childbirth was one of the biggest killers of women. So basically, being a woman in medieval Scotland came with a high risk of death. And also, more work. And guess who made up most of the accused witches? Yep, young women, old women, widows, midwives, and anyone who acted weird or refused to conform. Witch hunts weren't just about fear of magic. They were about control. Women who challenged norms were labeled dangerous. Women who knew too much about healing herbs? Definitely a witch. Women who talked back to their husband? Probably in league with the devil. So yeah, medieval Scotland wasn't exactly a feminist utopia. So, what did we learn today? That women and children in medieval Scotland lived hard lives filled with labour, early marriages and little freedom. But they were also resilient, resourceful and essential to keeping society running, even when history tried to erase them. Pause. While peasants shivered in mud huts, nobles lived in castle stone fortresses built for war and luxury. These places were cold, draughty, and often under siege, but at least there was a bed and maybe some meat. Pause. The feudal system meant lords owned the land, peasants worked it, and everyone paid taxes to the king. Unless the king got beheaded, which happened more than once. Castles weren't exactly five-star hotels. They were cold, damp, and often smelled like wet wool and old meat. But compared to peasant huts, they were palaces. The Great Hall was where lords held feasts, made political deals, and occasionally got stabbed by guests. The kitchens were full of servants roasting meats and dodging flying knives. And the bedrooms? Tiny, freezing, and usually haunted by the ghost of someone who got poisoned. The feudal system meant lords owned the land, knights protected it, and peasants worked it. In return, peasants got protection and taxes. Lots and lots of taxes. Lords collected rent and food, labour or money. If you didn't pay, you might find yourself thrown into the dungeon or worse, forced to marry your neighbour's goat. But lords weren't all powerful. They had to answer to higher nobles and, eventually, the king. And if you annoyed the wrong person, well, let's just say succession wasn't always peaceful. Lords were powerful, but also constantly fighting each other. Allegiances changed faster than your socks. One day, 2 clans were best friends. The next, they were burning each other's houses down. Being a noble meant living with one hand on your sword and the other on your will. Everyone wanted your land, your money, or your title. So yeah, no pressure. And don't forget betrayal. Some of the most dramatic deaths in history came not from battle, but from a trusted friend handing you over to your enemies for a bag of silver. Life as a noble wasn't all banquets and silk robes. If you lost favour with the king or got accused of treason, you could end up in a dungeon, exiled or executed. Marriages were arranged to secure alliances, not love, and if you survived long enough, you still had to worry about disease, famine, and being poisoned by someone who wanted your seat at the table. So yes, nobles had power, but they also had targets on their backs. And in medieval Scotland, that target was usually right between the eyes. So, what did we learn today? That life in medieval Scotland was brutal no matter who you were. Whether you were born poor, noble, or somewhere in between, survival meant hard work, sharp instincts, and maybe a good hiding spot during dinner parties. Pause. Thanks for joining me on this 10-hour journey through history. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell your friends to suffer through it too. Until next time's Line to Muff.